The candles flicker in the mortuary chamber of Brenwald Palace as I, Dr. Henrik Weiss, approach the silk-draped table with trembling hands. The year is 1855, and I have served as royal physician for 3 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for this final grotesque duty. The late King Maximilian III of Moravia lies before me, and I must document what historians will desperately try to erase: the anatomical monstrosity that destroyed not just 3 queens, but an entire empire. The candles flicker in the mortuary chamber of Brenwald Palace as I, Dr. Henrik Weiss, approach the silk-draped table with trembling hands. The year is 1855, and I have served as royal physician for 3 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for this final grotesque duty. The late King Maximilian III of Moravia lies before me, and I must document what historians will desperately try to erase: the anatomical monstrosity that destroyed not just 3 queens, but an entire empire. To understand Maximilian's curse, we must first examine the rot in the Moravian royal tree. For 300 years, the House of Schwarzenstein had married within itself cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, brother to sister when papal dispensations could be bought. Each generation produced fewer living children, more stillbirths, more monsters. Maximilian's own family tree was less a tree than a twisted vine strangling itself. His parents were double first cousins. His grandparents shared the same bloodline 4 different ways. The court genealogist, before his mysterious disappearance, had traced the corruption back to its source: King Leopold the Mad, who in 1498 had married his own sister in a secret ceremony, claiming God had commanded him to keep the bloodline pure as mountain snow. That snow became an avalanche of genetic catastrophe, each generation adding new horrors to the family legacy. The genetic poison manifested differently in each offspring. Maximilian's elder brother, Prince Friedrich, was born with a skull so misshapen he could barely wear the crown during ceremonies. His brain, compressed by bone that grew inward rather than out, gave him visions of apocalyptic futures that proved disturbingly accurate. His sister, Princess Katerina, spoke in tongues from age 5 and died mysteriously at 14 after claiming she could see demons in the walls, demons that, according to servants who fled the palace, left physical scratches on her body. Another brother emerged from the womb already dead, his body covered in scales like a fish, with gills that had never drawn breath. The midwives burned the corpse in secret, but not before I had made detailed sketches that still haunt my medical journals. But it was Maximilian who bore nature's cruelest joke, as if all the family's genetic sins had concentrated in one impossible organ. "Mother, why has God cursed me?" Young Maximilian's voice echoes through my memory. I was a junior physician then, secretly treating the teenage prince. The other boys at military academy, they mock me in the baths. They call me the elephant. Prince, they say I'm possessed by demons. Queen Isabella, herself a product of inbreeding with eyes that bulged like a toad's and fingers webbed with translucent skin, could only weep. She knew, as did the entire court, that her son's deformity went beyond the physical. The anatomical monster between his legs had created a psychological monster within his mind. She would spend hours in the chapel, flagellating herself until her back ran red, begging God to transfer her son's curse to her own body. By age 17, Maximilian had developed what I documented as acute genital obsessive paranoia. He became convinced that everyone, servants, nobles, foreign ambassadors, was constantly thinking about his deformity. And perhaps they were. How could they not, when specially reinforced chairs had to be crafted for him to sit? When his walk had an unmistakable waddle from the weight of his burden? When tailors had to create elaborate codpieces that looked more like armor than clothing? The prince began keeping what he called the Book of Glances, a leather-bound tome where he recorded every person who looked at his groin, the duration of their gaze, and his interpretation of their thoughts. By his 18th birthday, the book contained over 3,000 entries, each more paranoid than the last. Lord Dimitri stared for 3.5 seconds during court assembly plotting to expose me. Serving girl Maria averted eyes too quickly spreading rumors in the kitchens. His paranoia manifested in increasingly violent ways. A servant boy who accidentally spilled wine near the prince's lap was flogged until his back resembled raw meat, then exiled with his entire family. A young duchess who failed to maintain eye contact during a waltz found her father's lands mysteriously confiscated. The court composer who wrote a song about a dragon guarding its treasure was found dead in his chambers, his throat cut with his own violin strings. Maximilian developed elaborate rituals to protect his secret, though everyone knew he would only appear in public wearing multiple layers of clothing, regardless of season. Summer court sessions became infamous for their stench as the prince sweated through wool and leather while courtiers fainted from heat. He commissioned special walking sticks, not for support, but to hold in front of himself as he moved, creating the illusion of normalcy that fooled no one. The first attempt to normalize the prince came when he was 19. A renowned surgeon from Vienna, Dr. Ernst Kellner, claimed he could reduce the organ's size through a revolutionary procedure involving leeches, mercury applications, and surgical binding. The operation took place in absolute secrecy in the palace's abandoned tower, a place where screams would echo off stone walls, but never reach the outside world. Dr. Kellner had brought a team of specialists, an Ottoman physician who claimed expertise in male troubles, a mystic from Prague who insisted the procedure must align with planetary movements, and a former executioner skilled in the application of precise pain. I was ordered to assist and document, though every instinct screamed against it. The prince was strapped to a specially constructed table that resembled a torture device more than medical equipment. Iron restraints held his limbs while a leather bite guard protected his teeth. We dosed him with enough opium to tranquilize a horse, mixed with belladonna to open the spiritual channels according to the mystic. Maximilian's eyes rolled back, showing only whites, as we began. Dr. Kellner applied 30 medical leeches to the organ, believing they would drain the excess humors. The leeches, imported from the Black Forest and supposedly fed on virgin's blood to enhance their potency, attached themselves with unusual eagerness. Within minutes, they began to swell beyond any size I had seen in my medical career. The member itself, rather than shrinking, swelled even larger, turning purple-black like a rotting eggplant. The leeches, gorged beyond capacity, began bursting, like tiny blood-filled grapes, spattering the walls with crimson. Next came the mercury treatments. Liquid quicksilver was injected directly into the organ's base using a syringe designed for veterinary use. The theory was that mercury would rebalance the tissue and cause controlled shrinkage. Instead, it caused immediate and severe poisoning. Maximilian, despite the opium, began convulsing so violently that the iron restraints bent. He screamed in languages none of us recognized, ancient tongues that the mystic claimed were the speech of demons, leaving his body. For 3 weeks after, Maximilian experienced hallucinations that would have broken a weaker mind. He saw his member detaching and crawling away like a serpent, slithering through the palace to strangle his enemies. He claimed it spoke to him in his father's voice, revealing state secrets and prophesying doom. His vomit, tinted silver from the mercury, was collected by the mystic who declared it had alchemical properties. The surgical binding was the final horror. Dr. Kellner, growing desperate as his reputation hung in the balance, attempted to reshape the organ by wrapping it in specially treated leather strips. These strips, soaked in a concoction of wolf's blood, ground pearls, and what the Ottoman physician called virgin's tears, later revealed to be simply saline solution, were meant to be worn continuously for 6 months. After 3 days, the smell emanating from the prince's chambers was unbearable. Servants fled their posts, claiming the odor made them see visions of hell. When we finally cut away the bindings, portions of necrotized skin came with them, revealing tissue underneath that had developed a greenish, scale-like texture. New growths had formed bulbous protrusions that pulsated with their own rhythm, as if the organ had developed secondary hearts. The marriage negotiations for Maximilian began when he turned 21. Every royal family in Europe knew of his conditioned spy networks had ensured that. Most rejected the proposals outright. The few who showed interest demanded enormous dowries and special contractual clauses that humiliated the Moravian crown. Finally, Princess Elena of Saxburg was chosen, or rather, sacrificed. Her family, facing bankruptcy from failed wars, literally sold her for Moravian gold. Elena arrived in the winter of 1827, during a blizzard that locals took as an omen. She was 17, convent-educated, with hair like spun gold and eyes blue as forget-me-nots. The nuns had told her only that her future husband had certain physical peculiarities that required wifely understanding. They had not told her that court physicians had already prepared what they called the necessity chamber, a room that was part bedroom, part medical theater, part torture chamber. The wedding was a spectacle of unprecedented grandeur, as if gold and ceremony could mask the horror that awaited. Elena wore a gown of white silk studded with 10,000 pearls, each one representing, according to court symbolism, a tear she would shed in her marriage. Maximilian stood resplendent in military dress, the special codpiece hidden beneath layers of metallic finery. Foreign dignitaries remarked on what a handsome couple they made, though many noticed the bride's hands trembling as she spoke her vows. During the ceremony, I observed Elena closely. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes darted constantly to the exits. When Maximilian placed the ring on her finger, she flinched so slightly that only those of us who knew what awaited her would notice. The ring, specially made with a hidden compartment, contained a dose of laudanum, a mercy from the court jeweler who had daughters of his own. I had spent the previous week preparing the marital chamber. Special furniture had been constructed by craftsmen sworn to secrecy, and later found dead in various accidents. The bed featured strategic cutouts and supports, leather straps, discreetly hidden beneath silk sheets, and a complex system of pulleys that would allow for dot-dot positioning. Chairs with unusual angles were placed around the room, each designed for a specific purpose I dare not describe in detail. Various wooden and leather devices that looked more like torture implements than aids to intimacy lined the walls. That night, I waited outside the chamber with 2 other physicians, listening. First came Elena's nervous laughter, the kind that emerges when the mind cannot process what the eyes are seeing. Then confused questions. What is that? Why do we need? I don't understand. Then silence that stretched like a held breath. Then a scream that started low and rose to a pitch that seemed barely human. It went on and on, joined by the sound of furniture crashing, glass breaking, and Maximilian's voice alternating between pleading and commanding. We were ordered not to intervene for the first hour. By minute 45, the screams had become whimpers. By minute 50, silence. Unable to wait longer, we entered to find Elena backed into a corner, her wedding gown torn, her eyes wide with the kind of terror I'd seen in soldiers after watching their comrades blown apart by cannon fire. Blood pooled on the floor, not enough to be life-threatening, but enough to tell its own story. She pointed at Maximilian, who stood naked except for the special leather harness designed to support his monstrous organ, and spoke a single word: demon. Over the following months, Elena transformed from a vivacious young woman into a hollow-eyed ghost. She developed a pronounced flinch whenever Maximilian entered a room. She began speaking to invisible presences, holding full conversations with what she called the angels who watch over broken dolls. Her ladies-in-waiting reported finding her attempting to cut off her own hair with broken glass, claiming it was too beautiful for this ugliness. The conjugal visits were scheduled for specific lunar phases, based on the court astrologer's calculations for maximum fertility. Elena would be prepared hours in advance, bathed in special oils, dosed with carefully measured laudanum to achieve the exact balance between consciousness and compliance, dressed in garments designed for easy removal. She would lie on the specially designed bed, staring at the ceiling where someone had painted cherubs that seemed to mock her suffering. Twice, miraculously, Elena conceived. The court rejoiced, Maximilian's confidence soared, and for brief moments, it seemed the curse might be broken. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages that left the royal couple more traumatized than ever. The first miscarriage in 1828 occurred in the 4th month. Court physicians attributed it to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. What they meant but could never say openly was that Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality had made the sexual act so traumatic that Elena's body couldn't sustain a pregnancy to term. The second miscarriage was worse. Elena carried the child almost to full term before losing it in a labor so difficult and bloody that it nearly killed her. The infant, a boy, was born with deformities that the midwives refused to describe in their official reports. Maximilian, who had waited outside the birthing chamber for 20 hours, took one look at his malformed son and walked away without a word. The tiny corpse was buried in an unmarked grave in the palace gardens, where Elena would later be found, digging with her bare hands, trying to retrieve her baby. Image 18. Snow-covered palace garden with bloody footprints leading to statue. The end came after 18 months of marriage. Elena was found at dawn in the palace gardens, snow covering her thin nightgown, her lips blue with cold. She had walked barefoot from her chambers, leaving bloody footprints in the snow, and laid down beneath the statue of Saint Catherine, the patron saint of women who died rather than submit to unholy unions. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia brought on by winter exposure. But I performed the autopsy, and what I found defied medical explanation. Her internal organs showed signs of systematic trauma consistent with repeated violence. But there was something else, a peculiar crystallization of tissue around her reproductive organs, as if her body had literally tried to wall itself off from invasion. Some whispered it was a miracle, God's way of protecting her even in death. Others claimed it was evidence of witchcraft. I believe it was simply the physical manifestation of a soul trying desperately to escape an unbearable reality. Maximilian's reaction to Elena's death revealed the depths of his narcissistic delusion. He convinced himself she had been murdered by enemies seeking to prevent him from producing an heir. He ordered investigations, arrests, torture of suspected conspirators. But within months, his advisors were already seeking a second wife. Duchess Sophia of Brenwald was a different creature entirely, a 28-year-old widow rumored to have poisoned her first husband when she discovered his gambling debts. Sophia came to the marriage with eyes wide open and a plan. She had consulted with physicians, mystics, and what some whispered were practitioners of the dark arts. She negotiated a contract that guaranteed her separate chambers, limited conjugal visits to specific lunar phases, and the right to maintain her own guard. Most importantly, she brought with her a retinue of occultists who claimed they could transmute Maximilian's curse into power. Sophia believed in what she called sexual alchemy, the idea that Maximilian's deformity was not a curse, but a gift that simply needed proper channeling. Her chambers became a laboratory of the bizarre, filled with charts tracking celestial movements, jars containing preserved animal organs, particularly those of bulls and stallions, and books bound in what appeared to be human skin. Strange smells emanated from her quarters at all hours: sulfur, rotting flowers, and something sweet yet nauseating that made servants gag. Their intimate encounters were preceded by elaborate rituals that transformed the bedchamber into a pagan temple. Sophia would burn specific incenses that made the air thick and hallucinogenic. She painted symbols on both their bodies with a mixture of menstrual blood, ground gemstones, and what she claimed was powder made from the bones of hanged men. She would chant in languages that predated Christ, calling upon entities whose names I dare not record. Maximilian, desperate for any solution, submitted to these occult ceremonies with disturbing enthusiasm. He allowed himself to be bound with ropes made from human hair, wore amulets crafted from the preserved organs of executed criminals, and drank potions that made his eyes roll back and foam appear at his mouth. During these sessions, witnesses reported hearing sounds that couldn't possibly come from human throat growls, clicking noises, and what one guard described as the sound of wet leather being stretched to its breaking point. Miraculously, or perhaps through darker means, Sophia conceived within 6 months. The pregnancy was unlike anything in medical literature. Her belly would swell and shrink according to no natural rhythm. Some days she appeared ready to give birth, others barely pregnant at all. She claimed to feel not one child, but a legion moving within her. Her skin took on a greenish tinge, and her eyes began to glow in the dark with a phosphorescent light that terrified her servants. She developed appetites that defied explanation. She would demand raw meat, still bloody, and consume it with her bare hands. She drank concoctions of wine mixed with powdered beetles and mercury. Most disturbing, she began speaking in multiple voices, sometimes simultaneously, carrying on conversations between what she called the mother and the children. Court physicians were at a loss, their medical training useless against whatever grew within her womb. The birth, when it came, defied all natural law. After 36 hours of labor that sounded more like an exorcism than a delivery, Sophia produced not a child but an abomination. The thing that emerged had multiple partially formed limbs that moved independently, patches of scales like a reptile, and most horrifying, several eyes that opened and tracked movement with obvious intelligence before the creature expired. The midwives fled screaming, several never to practice their craft again. One later entered a convent and spent the rest of her days in silent prayer. Another was found days later, having clawed out her own eyes while babbling about the thing that looked back at me. Sophia herself, delirious from pain and blood loss, cradled the monstrosity like a beloved child, singing lullabies in her multiple voices before finally succumbing to hemorrhage. Her last words, spoken in a voice definitely not her own, were, "The first seal is broken. Others will follow." Maximilian's descent into complete madness accelerated after Sophia's death. He began conducting full conversations with portraits of his dead wives, asking their painted faces for forgiveness or accusing them of conspiracy. He would strip naked in the throne room, displaying his deformity to terrified courtiers while screaming, "Behold your king! Behold what God has made!" His member, I noted with clinical horror, had continued growing, now so large it dragged on the ground when he walked, leaving trails of clear fluid that servants had to constantly clean. He commissioned artists to paint him as various mythological creatures, centaurs, satyrs, chimeras, all featuring his grotesque member as the dominant element. These paintings, which now hang in locked rooms in the palace, show a mind completely divorced from reality. In one, he is depicted as Zeus, his organ transformed into a lightning bolt. In another, he appears as a dragon, his member breathing fire. The artists who created these works were paid handsomely, then disappeared under mysterious circumstances. It was during this period that Maximilian commissioned the construction of what he called the Chamber of Transformation, an underground medical facility where increasingly desperate attempts were made to alter his anatomy. He brought in surgeons from across Europe, many of them charlatans and madmen who had been expelled from legitimate medical institutions. The procedures they performed in that hellish chamber would make medieval torturers blanch. One surgeon attempted to graft animal tissue onto the organ, believing that combining human and beast would create a more manageable hybrid. The procedure involved fresh tissue from bulls, horses, and even more exotic animals. The rejection was immediate and horrific, resulting in infections that produced smells so foul that even hardened physicians vomited. Another tried to install a mechanical apparatus inside the member, a system of tubes and valves that would allow for manual control. The device, made of copper and brass, caused such severe metal poisoning that Maximilian's skin turned green for months. The search for a third wife became a grotesque farce that showed how far the Moravian crown had fallen. No royal family would even consider the match. Maximilian's advisors were reduced to searching among the minor nobility, then the merchant class, and finally among imprisoned criminals. It was there they found Countess Maria of Rothstein, whose family had been imprisoned for treason. The marriage was quite literally her ransom: marry the monster or watch her family hang. Maria arrived at court in chains, which were removed only for the wedding ceremony. Unlike her predecessors, she harbored no illusions about her fate. She was 32, had been married before, and had survived 2 years in the royal dungeons. She possessed a hardness that came from seeing the worst of humanity and surviving it. When she first laid eyes on Maximilian, she neither screamed nor flinched. She simply said, "So the stories were true. Very well, let us discuss terms." Maria negotiated like a merchant rather than a bride. She demanded her own wing of the palace, her own guards, and most importantly, the right to document everything. She knew her story would be valuable someday, and she intended to survive to tell it. She kept detailed diaries written in a cipher of her own devising, documenting every assault, every medical procedure, every descent deeper into the king's madness. Her writings, which I helped smuggle out of the palace page by page, provide the most complete record of Maximilian's final years. She described his organ with clinical detachment. Tuesday, March 15th. The member now measures 18 inches in repose, 24 when engorged. New growths have appeared along the shaft, pulsating with independent circulation. The smell is indescribable: rotting flowers mixed with sulfur. During our monthly obligation, it requires 4 servants to support its weight. I have timed my laudanum doses perfectly. I feel nothing. By this time, Maximilian's paranoia had transformed the entire palace into a surveillance state. He believed Maria was communicating with foreign powers through coded movements during their intimate encounters. He had her chambers filled with hidden peepholes and listening tubes that led to a central monitoring room where scribes worked in shifts, recording every sound, every movement. The walls themselves became honeycombed with passages where guards crouched in darkness, watching and listening. The king developed elaborate theories about Maria's treason. He believed she was using vaginal contractions to send Morse code to Austrian spies. He accused her of poisoning his member with secretions designed to prevent conception. He had samples of her bodily fluids collected and analyzed by alchemists who claimed to find evidence of witchcraft. One reported finding daemon seed in her monthly blood. Another detected the essence of rebellion in her tears. The political consequences of Maximilian's madness were reaching critical mass. Foreign ambassadors reported back about the demon king of Moravia, whose sexual dysfunction had become state dysfunction. Trade agreements collapsed as diplomats refused to negotiate with a monarch who might suddenly disrobe or accuse them of staring at his groin. One French ambassador wrote, "The king's member has become the unofficial ruler of Moravia. All state decisions are made based on its comfort. All resources devoted to its cure, all thoughts focused on its demands." Revolutionary movements gained strength daily. Pamphlets circulated showing caricatures of Maximilian, with his organ transformed into various symbols of oppression, a chain binding the nation, a serpent devouring Moravia's children, a battering ram destroying the palace of state. One famous illustration showed the entire country balanced precariously on the tip of the king's member, about to topple into chaos. Maria, showing remarkable courage, became the first person to simply refuse the king's demands. One night in 1853, when summoned for her monthly ordeal, she appeared in the throne room fully dressed and declared before the entire court, "I will no longer submit to unnatural acts that offend God and nature. If you must kill me, do so, but I will not willingly participate in this abomination any longer." The court held its breath. Maximilian's face went through a spectrum of colors: red, purple, white, then a sickly green. His member, visible through his specially designed robes, began to twitch and writhe as if it had its own emotional responses. For a long moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then Maximilian did something unexpected. He laughed a sound like breaking glass that echoed through the throne room. "You dare refuse your king?" he asked. "Then you shall watch others pay for your defiance." What followed was a campaign of psychological torture that revealed the true depths of Maximilian's sadism. He had Maria's family brought to the palace, her elderly parents, her siblings, her young nieces and nephews. He forced her to watch as they were subjected to increasingly creative punishments. Not physical torture in the traditional sense, but humiliations designed to break the spirit. Her father was forced to serve as a footstool during court sessions. Her mother had to sing lullabies to the preserved corpse of Sophia's monstrous offspring. The children were made to play games where losing meant watching their parents suffer further degradation. Yet Maria held firm. She documented everything in her hidden diaries, her handwriting steady even as she described horrors that would break most minds. "He believes he is breaking me," she wrote, "but each atrocity only strengthens my resolve. I am the mirror in which he sees his own monstrosity reflected. That is why he hates me, not for my defiance, but for my clarity." The revolution began not with armies or grand declarations, but with a simple refusal. Palace servants, inspired by Maria's defiance, began declining to perform their duties. The specialists who maintained Maximilian's medical equipment disappeared. In the night, the craftsmen who built his special furniture closed their workshops. The physicians who had enabled his madness suddenly discovered urgent business in other countries. The palace, dependent on these specialized services, began to fall apart. By spring of 1854, the situation was untenable. Maximilian could no longer appear in public without causing riots. His member had grown so large that he required a specially constructed wheelchair with supports to move around. The organ had developed what appeared to be tumors that wept of foul-smelling pus. His mind, poisoned by years of mercury treatments and exotic drugs, could no longer distinguish between reality and hallucination. He held conversations with his member, which he had named Leviathan, asking it for advice on matters of state. The final assault came on October 13, 1854, ironically, Maximilian's birthday. A coalition of nobles, merchants, and commoners stormed the palace. They found little resistance. Most of the guards had already fled or joined the revolution. The revolutionaries made their way to the Chamber of Transformation, where intelligence suggested they would find the king. What they discovered there defied comprehension. Maximilian lay on an operating table, surrounded by the corpses of 3 surgeons, who had apparently died during whatever procedure they had been attempting. The king was connected to a bizarre apparatus involving tubes, pumps, and what appeared to be preserved organs from various animals. His member, now easily 2 feet long and covered in surgical scars, was being fitted with a mechanical exoskeleton made of brass and leather. The revolutionary leader, a former cavalry officer named Victor Steinberg, later described the scene. "We expected to find a tyrant. Instead, we found a broken creature barely recognizable as human. His body was a patchwork of scars, failed surgeries, and inhuman modifications. The smell. God, the smell. Like a slaughterhouse mixed with a chemical factory. Several of my men vomited immediately. Others fell to their knees in prayer." Maximilian, delirious from pain and drugs, didn't seem to recognize the danger he was in. He looked at the armed revolutionaries and said, "Ah, more physicians. Have you come to see my transformation? Soon I shall transcend this flesh and become what I was meant to be, a god of fertility, a living phallus that will seed the world with my divine essence." Victor, showing more mercy than many thought wise, ordered his men to stand down. "There is no glory in killing whatever this creature has become," he said. But Maximilian's own actions sealed his fate. In his delirium, he activated some mechanism on the operating table. The surgical equipment began moving on its own, blades spinning, needles injecting. Within moments, the king had essentially performed his own execution. The machines he had commissioned to transform him instead tearing him apart in a shower of blood and tissue. In the aftermath, I was summoned to perform a final duty. The Revolutionary Council, recognizing the historical importance of documenting this madness, ordered me to preserve the organ that had caused so much suffering. The procedure took 3 days. The member had grown so complex with its own network of blood vessels, nerve clusters that seemed to respond to stimuli independently, and tissue unlike anything in medical literature, that it required multiple preservation techniques. Used methods learned from Egyptian embalmers, combined with the latest chemical preservation techniques. The organ was divided into sections, each preserved differently to maintain various aspects for future study. The main shaft went into a specially blown glass container filled with a mixture of alcohol and formaldehyde. The tumorous growths were preserved in separate jars with different chemical combinations. Tissue samples were prepared for microscopic examination. The entire collection filled 17 containers of various sizes. The preserved specimens were sent under heavy guard to the Vatican archives. The Church, complicit in centuries of sanctioned inbreeding that had created this monstrosity, wanted the evidence hidden but not destroyed. They understood that someday, someone would need to study this artifact to understand how the personal becomes political, how the body becomes the body politic. The containers were sealed with blessed wax and marked with warnings in 7 languages. Swiss guards were assigned to protect them, though several requested transfers after reporting strange sounds from the storage room, liquid sloshing when no one was near, tapping on glass as if something inside wanted out. Image 37. Countess Maria writing her memoirs in exile. Maria survived the revolution, the only queen to outlive Maximilian. The Revolutionary Council, recognizing her courage, granted her a pension and safe passage to Switzerland. She spent her remaining years writing memoirs that no publisher dared print in her lifetime. Her manuscripts, discovered in a Swiss bank vault in 1923, provide insights that historians had long suspected but never dared voice. "He was a monster," she wrote in her final entry, "but we were the Dr. Frankensteins who created him. Every aristocrat who married their cousin to keep wealth in the family, every bishop who blessed incestuous unions for gold, every physician who enabled rather than healed, we all built the creature that Maximilian became. His deformed member was merely the visible symptom of a diseased system that valued blood purity over human dignity." The Moravian Empire collapsed within months of Maximilian's death. Foreign powers carved up the territory like vultures on a corpse. The palace was abandoned, left to rot like the bloodline that had ruled from it. Today, it stands empty, a monument to the dangers of unchecked power and genetic corruption. Locals report strange phenomena shadows that move independently. Wet dragging sounds in the corridors, and most disturbing, the appearance of fluid trails that match the patterns left by Maximilian's dragging member. The Chamber of Transformation, sealed by the revolutionary government, was broken into by urban explorers in 1923. They found medical equipment that had somehow continued functioning for decades, still pumping fluids through tubes connected to nothing. One explorer reported seeing something pale and massive, moving in the darkness before fleeing. He never spoke of what he saw in detail, but spent his remaining years in an asylum, drawing obsessive sketches of tentacled creatures. Recent archaeological excavations have uncovered more evidence of Maximilian's reign of anatomical terror. Hidden rooms filled with medical devices that defy explanation, chairs with holes cut in increasingly bizarre patterns, harnesses designed for positions that human anatomy shouldn't allow, and most disturbing, what appears to be attempts at creating artificial members, as if Maximilian had been trying to build replacements for his cursed organ. One room contained over 50 prototype penises made from various materials: wood, metal, preserved animal tissue, and substances that modern science cannot identify. The journals of court physicians, discovered in a sealed vault, reveal the true extent of medical crimes committed in the name of treating Maximilian. Dr. Friedrich Honstein wrote of experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. Today we attempted to graft nerve tissue from executed criminals onto His Majesty's member, hoping to gain better control over its movements. The screams lasted 4 hours. The tissue rejection was immediate, but not before the organ displayed what I can only describe as independent consciousness, moving and grasping like a blind serpent seeking prey. Image 42. Secret Society meeting discussing the Moravian bloodline. Evidence has emerged of a secret society formed by survivors of Maximilian's court, dedicated to ensuring that his genetic line truly ended. They called themselves the Order of Genetic Vigilance and spent decades tracking down anyone who might carry Schwarzstein blood. Their records, written in coded Latin, speak of pruning the poisoned tree and cleansing operations carried out across Europe, several mysterious. Deaths of distant Moravian nobles in the late 1800s are now attributed to this organization. More disturbing are reports from villages near the abandoned palace of mysterious pregnancies in the years following Maximilian's death. Women claim to have dreams of a great serpent visiting them in the night, followed by pregnancies that ended in miscarriages of severely deformed fetuses. Local priests documented 17 such cases between 1855 and 1860, all within a 20-mile radius of the palace. The malformed remains preserved in church crypts show similarities to the creature Sophia birthed: multiple limbs, scale-like skin, and too many eyes. In 1962, a Vatican researcher was granted limited access to study the preserved specimens. Dr. Antonio Berlinghetti's report, classified immediately after submission, contained findings that challenged medical understanding. The tissue samples showed cellular activity decades after preservation, impossible by any known science. DNA analysis revealed chromosomal arrangements that shouldn't exist in humans' extra pairs, bizarre mutations, and what Berlinghetti described as genetic sequences that appear artificial, as if engineered by some intelligence. More troubling were the psychological effects on researchers. 3 Vatican archivists who worked with the specimens developed what was termed sympathetic anatomical dysfunction. Their own organs began showing unusual growth patterns. One developed tumors arranged in patterns matching the nodules on Maximilian's preserved member. Another began experiencing phantom limb syndrome for appendages he never had. All 3 were quietly transferred to isolated monasteries where they spent their remaining days in prayer and medical observation. The palace continues to draw those fascinated by the macabre. In 2003, a documentary crew attempting to film in the Chamber of Transformation reported equipment failures that seemed to follow a pattern. Cameras would malfunction when pointed at certain angles. Audio equipment would pick up sounds and frequencies that caused nausea and disorientation. And most unsettling, thermal imaging showed heat signatures in the shape of a massive dragging appendage in rooms that had been empty for over a century. One crew member, sound engineer Sarah Chun, described her experience. "I was adjusting the boom mic when I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down and saw, I can't even describe it properly. It was like a wet tentacle, but also somehow mechanical. It left a trail of some kind of oil or fluid. When I screamed, it just disappeared. The smell lingered for hours like rotting flowers mixed with motor oil. Modern genetic research has shed new light on the Schwarzstein curse. Analysis of hair samples from various family members, preserved in lockets and mourning jewelry, reveals a cascade of mutations that shouldn't be compatible with life. Dr. Helena Varga, a geneticist who studied the samples, published a paper suggesting that the Moravian royal family had developed what she termed directed evolution. Their genes were changing in response to some external factor, possibly environmental. Toxins from centuries of alchemical experiments, or something more inexplicable. What we see in the Schwarzstein genome, Dr. Varga wrote, is not random mutation, but something that appears almost purposeful. As if the human DNA was being rewritten to become something else. Maximilian's condition may have been the most visible manifestation, but evidence suggests the entire bloodline was undergoing transformation. Into what? We can only speculate. Conspiracy theories about Maximilian's legacy persist into the modern era. Online forums dedicate thousands of pages to tracking potential descendants, analyzing portraits for signs of anatomical abnormality, and documenting mysterious deaths. That might be connected to the order of genetic vigilance. Some claim that the preserved specimens were secretly moved from the Vatican to a research facility where attempts are being made to clone or recreate Maximilian's unique genetics. One persistent theory suggests that Maximilian's condition was not natural, but the result of an ancient curse placed on the Schwarzstein line by a Rama woman burned as a witch in 1489. According to palace records, she cursed the family to bear their sins in their flesh, and that their pride would hang between their legs for all to see. While historians dismiss this as folklore, the correlation between the curse's wording and Maximilian's condition raises uncomfortable questions. The medical community remains divided on Maximilian's condition. Conferences on historical pathology feature heated debates between those who insist it was simply severe macrocephalus combined with various tumors, and those who argue the documented symptoms don't match any known condition. Dr. Richard Steinberg, a urologist who spent years studying the available evidence, concluded, "We're dealing with something outside normal medical parameters. The growth patterns, the apparent autonomous movement, the psychological effects on those who witnessed it, none of this fits with simple gigantism or tumor formation."